This video was originally a section in my Games of the Year and Disappointments of 2020 video. It got so long that I decided to make its own video out of it. I know some people really enjoyed the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and it does some things really well too. In the context of this video's original intent, I mainly focus here on its weaknesses though, and it can be a bit like a rant. Also, huge spoiler warning for Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VII Remake. And in case you watch this at the 9th of March 2021, so on this video's release day, there will be the first episode of my new podcast live streamed on Twitch today. So check it out if you want. We talk about games and Tolkien. Two of my favorite games of all time are the first Deus Ex from 2000 and Final Fantasy VII from 1997. Maybe it was Final Fantasy VII's complicated story that awoke in me the desire to analyze stories, to look deeper into things and finding interesting interpretations back in the day as a teenager. All this led to me making an over 60-minute long video about the Jenova Theory in April 2020. Maybe check it out if you're interested. I really have a lot of passion for the original Final Fantasy VII, but far less for all the other Final Fantasy VII related releases that came after it. As you can imagine, as a longtime fan, I was curious how the Final Fantasy VII Remake would turn out, and if you have seen my streams, you know what's coming now. I try to avoid ranting, but explain what and why I didn't like it. The Final Fantasy VII Remake is a weird game from my perspective. It does some things really well. The visual direction and how they managed to transport the original style and look into a modern game from 2020 is really impressive. The music is mostly great, the combat is okayish for my taste, found the normal difficulty far too easy, and without a deeper understanding of the system behind it and without the right build, you often end up waiting for your ATB bars to fill, which often kills the pacing of the combat. I like how the characters look and that the developers still managed to keep some elements that felt a bit anime in the original, like how Cloud enters the train in this scene and so on. However, the related games that came after the original, especially the film, totally lost the balance between the more grounded style of the original and just some anime shenanigans. Instead, they reduced the grounded style and went full over-the-top anime. Sadly, Final Fantasy VII Remake is no exception. Nothing against over-the-top anime, but it does not fit the original and also generates dissonances in the story that kill the immersion, the game's logic, and make it hard to take the relatively serious story of the original serious. Suddenly, characters can jump 50 meters into the air and cut trains in half, but jumping over this 50-centimeter high obstacle is impossible. That is my first criticism, and one reason I don't like the other Final Fantasy VII entries too much too. This over-the-top style might work for other series, but not so well for Final Fantasy VII, especially in a remake. Sure, it looks cool, but for me, Final Fantasy VII is just so much more, and not just style over substance. What we can often observe in other series with this over-the-top combat style is a constant power creep. Each big boss encounter needs to surpass the last, slowly coming to the point where visualization and story has difficulties representing further increases of power in a coherent way. I would say Dragon Ball is a classic example, but it's still fun and designed around that concept. It becomes, however, more problematic in a game and setting like Final Fantasy VII. How will boss fights look when the remake reaches the actual end of Final Fantasy VII? Why not jump into space and destroy the meteor with your sword, One Punch Man style? If your character can jump 20 meters into the air and cut trains flying at him in half with his sword, level design in a linear game like FF7 Remake becomes a nightmare, except when you ignore the fact that Cloud, Tifa and friends can do this and pretend they can't. This, however, makes some scenes in the game flat out ridiculous or nonsensical. I fight against gods, but I can't jump over this little workshop wagon that even has rolls under it. When I, the guy narrating this video, can climb over that, Cloud and Tifa can do that too. In this scene we need to get to the other side of the train, but we have to take a huge, artificially prolonged detour to get there. Cut to this scene and you scratch your head in disbelief. I mean, at least Cloud and Tifa can jump on it and just pull Aerith up. In the original, it was a very short section, and you believe the game that Cloud, Aerith and Tifa can't jump over it. Not to mention invisible walls that are present in the remake too, which were already immersion breaking in games from decades ago, and they are still today. It's not pretty when we still find them in a AAA game from 2020. It's not a good idea to implement over-the-top elements into your story and cutscenes when your level design heavily relies on walls, boxes and fences to limit the player's path and movement options. In this scene, Tifa fears falling down, but that seems just so out of place considering her flying high in the air, punching enemies. That is a disconnect from what the game tells you in its cutscenes and also in combat. I won't use the unpopular word here, but it's exactly that. If you plan on using these very classical level limitations, then maybe do not make your characters be able to jump this high. And if you do, you have to make changes to how levels are built. The level design in this game is also very shallow. Most of the game looks beautiful, but you can't interact a lot with the environment. The game is even more linear than the original Final Fantasy VII. Most parts of the game are just tubes, and the game does not hide it well. I rarely felt like I could explore the wonders of the megacity Midgar. The game always dictated where I should go and where not. Don't get me wrong, the original is also very linear, but not that linear. For example, in the remake are those "you can't go here yet" elements, like a wrong direction symbol in a racing game. When you try to go through them, your character slows down and turns around automatically, meaning you lose control over the character for a moment. I can't express in words how much I hate it when games do that. It's such an immersion killer and shows that developers were unable to solve this elegantly. In the original game, which released over 24 years ago, this was not a thing. How is it possible that a game from 2020 can't do the same, claim to expand the world of the original and still feel even more linear? You could argue it's a technical limitation, but no, later in the game it is possible to go almost everywhere and those wrong direction markers vanish. It's just that the game developers do not want you to go there and put basically temporarily invisible walls into the level so you won't leave the story relevant area and maybe walk into a trigger that would skip a sequence of the game. It's not that I want to skip a part of the game, like a speedrunner, and skipping those markers is of course part of speedruns, but why not let me just go there and explore the area when I feel like exploring it like in the original? At least put some more effort into it than an UI element and an invisible wall in a bad disguise. The original game did this much better. Speaking of over the top, the Final Fantasy VII Remake only covers a fraction of the original game. It's done in like 5 to 8 hours in the original, and it's almost like a tutorial or introduction to the story. At the end of the remake, we fight fate itself. We even fight Sephiroth and Jenova, both in a spectacular fight with tons of spells, summons, abilities, and visions of the future. This was of course not part of Final Fantasy VII. In contrast, all upcoming bosses of the original seem pretty lame in comparison to what we just saw in the remake. In Final Fantasy VII, the first meeting with Jenova and Sephiroth is relatively late. It slowly builds them up as extremely powerful and mysterious villains that are somehow connected to almost all playable characters, Shinra and the Cetra. I remember trying to defeat the giant snake in the swamp on my first playthrough directly, but could not do it with my current level. Then I caught a chocobo and crossed the swamp with its help, the intended way, and we see this cutscene. It truly showed how powerful Sephiroth must be, and you question the idea of the heroes to chase him that early without further preparation. We also see Sephiroth fight this dragon in Cloud's memory in Calm, where we first see him. We deal like 14 damage to the dragon. It just one-shots us, and it would likely still one-shot us when our party leaves Midgar. While the dragon seems so powerful, it in contrast can't even damage Sephiroth, who just destroys it. The build-up is just ruined in the remake. We already fought not the dragon, but the dragon slayer himself successfully, and even defeated him to some degree. So what's the big deal? I think I beat Sephiroth's first try in the remake too. Easy. That is a huge difference between the remake and the original, and one that I really dislike. How the remake tries to make Sephiroth seem powerful is by removing control from the player and starting a cutscene where suddenly the combat part we control gets interrupted and suddenly Sephiroth is just toying with us. Well, we just destroyed him a moment ago. We are back to over-the-top territory that does not fit the game and have this typical pseudo-cryptic blah 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 Mr. Freeman dialogue. At no point I have the feeling, oh wow, the Sephiroth guy is unbeatable right now, will be tough taking him down if we will ever face him, and I will need tons of preparations for the confrontation, like in the original. The build-up is just not good anymore in the remake, and it's hard to imagine how the fights will look later in the story. We probably fly hundreds of meters through the air, and the shock waves of our clashing swords destroy mountains, but only in cutscenes. If we want to climb over a little crate, that is impossible. The disconnect between cutscenes and played game is just too strong, and presenting us spectacular boss fights with visions of the potential future from the end of the original so early in the story already takes much away of the big moments to come, and also makes those hard to balance. I'm curious if they will change the direction in the next games a bit. What is also a big complaint that really made me angry is the pacing of the remake. The pacing is just all over the place. Of course, this is a problem because in the original it's just a 5 to 8 hour long section, not a 30-hour long game. So stretching everything is required. The original section is more dense. It also slows down the story and game here and there, but in a more harmonic way, leaving room for you to explore the world organically by following the story. The original Wall Market section is a good example. In the remake, they drew everything out. I hope they would simply add a lot of cool new content, but most of the added sections are not that great or were stretched massively, like the crane riddle that we have to do not once, but thrice in a row, or walking long tube levels where nothing happens, with some questionable texture work in the background. All these holes and cracks in walls you have to slowly, very slowly, climb through. I know that they are meant to hide a loading screen, but this is also not always the case, and I have seen it better implemented in other games too. I often felt like the game is actively wasting my time with absolutely boring elements. For example, in the sewer level, you find a closed gate. Guess where the lever for it is? Yes, at the exit, at the end of the level. So you have to walk all the way back to the gate through an already cleared level, and then all the way back to the exit again, and nothing happens on the way because you already beat the level. They could have let you find some hidden code fragments on the way that in a small riddle allows you to enter the correct code for the gate or something. No, it has to be a lever at the exit. That is not well designed, but shows that the game got in many places longer by not adding interesting new content, but instead by actively wasting your time with repetition, walking long tube sections, and nonsensical backtracking. For me, most of the added content felt just tacked on without any impact. For example, we have the fight against this guy, who only reappears one time at the warehouse and is then never seen again. Here we see that Cloud can also jump 10 meters or more into the air from one motorcycle to another. It does not really feel like it belongs into the game. Maybe if they made it like a fun little optional side quest with some cool payoff, it would have worked better. The later boss fight is okay, I guess, but what difference does it really make for the game? If this main mission would have been missing, I would not have noticed it, except that the game would be shorter. Beyond little new sections like these, they also added some optional side quests, and most of them are just very boring. I would go as far that the only newly added content I liked was the Jessie visits her parents section. I would have wished for more new content like this. Speaking of things I dislike, and here again a huge spoiler warning. Whispers or fate ghosts. Oh boy, the fate ghost. A big motive in the original story is loss and death, its consequences and dealing with it. Not sure what the creators thought when they wrote the remake, but it seems one idea was how they can decrease and water down this aspect from the original game's story as much as possible. So they implemented those ghosts as some kind of meta commentary on making a remake of an already written story and play around with death itself. We see Barrett getting killed, which does not happen in the original, and then he is revived by those ghosts to bring the story back on track. We also see Wedge not die, but then later he might die, and we see Big survive, and even Jessie's survival is hinted at. We see her glove and maybe her bandana on the table. We even see Zack survive. In the original, Midgar and a short area around it, in case of Zack, is the place of death for them. But with this supernatural element and maybe other unknown factors, they remove the impact of death. It is now part of the story and the writers can pull it out whenever they want to kill, protect or even revive a character, like a Deus Ex Machina. The death of a character has no impact anymore because of that, and that is not good in a story about loss and death. You could argue the fate is defeated at the end and won't appear anymore. Now a total new story unfolds, but the fact that a power like this exists inside the story allows the writers to find whatever arbitrary reason to use it. As a result, one of the most impactful elements in storytelling, death, will always feel arbitrary. This also implies some kind of parallel universe. In the case of what Sephiroth says, maybe even time travel. We see visions of later events of the story already, in part from the ending of Final Fantasy VII, showing the meteor hitting Midgar. Transforming a well-told story about loss and death into a time travel parallels universe story with fate ghosts is, in my opinion, not a good idea. A story like this must be designed from scratch and not be some weird meta commentary afterthought marketed as remaking Final Fantasy VII. So far, it seems more like a weird spin-off in an alternative universe. I personally would have loved to experience the original story of Final Fantasy VII, maybe with minor changes if needed in a modern game, but changing it into a weird meta-commentary time travel multiverse mess is definitely not what I want. Of course, taste can be different here. Some people might find that interesting, but I'm not one of them. Don't get me wrong, if the story of the remake would be a what if Zack or Biggs or whoever survived scenario, I would be potentially cool with it too, as long as it's a well-told story and they communicated this idea properly in advance. But so far it's not a well-told story because of all those weird story additions out of nowhere. All characters except for maybe Wedge survive. And even here, we can't be 100% sure now because the writers do with death whatever they want, and we do not see him die. We know the trope: if a character falls down somewhere into the abyss and we don't see the corpse, he is 100% still alive. And that is not the best storytelling in my opinion. Because of that, I'm not excited to find out if he survived or not. I just find it nonsensical because his potential death or survival can't develop naturally out of the story anymore or serve an impactful purpose in the story because of how death is used in the remake. It's now a noticeable decision by the writers forced on the story and not part of the story's universe anymore. Of course, that is always the case, that the writers decide what happens, who dies and who lives, but usually writers hide this and implement it well into their story instead. I guess a good story hides the functions the writer used to form it. This is not the case here anymore. Even other events are affected. The destruction of Sector 7, all NPC characters who had a name above their head survived, somehow. Only those die who we never see and at whose existence only a muddy texture of the Midgar slums in the background hints. The texture seems to be at least fixed in the upcoming PlayStation 5 version. That was different in the original, which made realizing all these deaths very depressing and Malene surviving really impactful. The other kids in Sector 7 had not the same luck. It's like the remake fears killing characters, and that is a problem in a game about death and loss of loved ones. And maybe even that would not be a problem if it wasn't due to supernatural elements tacked on top of everything that came out of nowhere and were not part of the original idea. And blowing the game length up from originally 5 to 8 hours to around 30 hours does not help either. The remake is a complete full-price game by itself, and looking at it alone, the story is now almost nonsensical with some of those new additions to it. Of course, one could argue, I'm curious where this goes now, and you can interpret it as the story is now free from the shackles of the original story and will be completely different from now on, but you could have achieved the same without adding these fate ghosts to it. Just let Jessie, Biggs and Wedge not die in the pillar section by just letting them escape. Just tell the story differently and develop this change organically. Don't do it with a Deus Ex Machina out of thin air that will cause more problems than it solves, even reducing the meaning of death itself inside the story. Considering that I disliked the stories of single-player Final Fantasy games after Final Fantasy XII, my confidence in Square's storytelling is not the best anymore. I'm not sure where the writers will go from here and what they try to achieve. In some interviews it sounded like they will tell the story we know and not stray too far away from it. In other interviews it seems it will be a totally new story. With Zack still being alive, I don't fully see it being too similar to the original, to be honest. I start to spin in circles here and repeat myself, but I hope I could transport these points well enough. This particular element resulting in stupid changes to the story, already cranking everything up to 11 this early in the story, and the extreme stretching resulting in pacing problems and boring sections are my largest criticisms for the remake. From my perspective, I can only recommend playing the original game instead. Stay away from fan translations on your first playthrough, because some of them add things that weren't in the text originally. The remake is sadly often far away from the complex and sometimes complicated original story, and will be sadly quite different, it seems. So if you want the original story, you won't find it in the remake. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little video. As said, originally this was a section of another video, but it got too long. And once I also wanted to make a Final Fantasy VII Remake review after release, but decided against it, even though I started writing it already back in the day, so you could say this video came a long way, and it's also less a fair review but a critique that focuses on elements that annoyed me a lot. If you liked it, feel free to press a like button. Also, let me know your thoughts on what I discussed in the video in a comment, and in case you are still listening and want to subscribe for whatever reason, consider pressing the stupid bell. I had some minor sound problems but could later solve them in the recording, so I hope it was not too bad. Next video is the mentioned Top Games of 2020 video and a Tolkien lore video about Elrond. Also, check out my podcast. The first episode releases today, so 9th of March 2021. It will be live streamed on Twitch. Again, thank you for watching. Stay safe and healthy in these difficult times, and goodbye.